grand halls of medieval courts were not simply places where people lived. They were meticulously constructed theatrical sets. Every gilded archway, every silken drape, every serving platter was a prop in an endless drama for survival. For those who sought to climb the rigid ladders of nobility, mere skill or piety was insufficient currency. What was required was performance, the mastery of social deceit. Our lives, we discover, were not lived, they were performed from the moment one entered the echoing splendor of a feast hall and remained until the last whisper settled into lethal silence. Into this intoxicating, poisonous environment steps Alara. She is brilliant, undeniably so, possessing an intellect that shines like rare jewelry. Yet she lacks the deep-rooted history, the ingrained tribal knowledge of the established houses. She represents possibility, but in a court where lineage was more binding than law, she was inherently vulnerable. The first challenge arrived at a lavish banquet thrown by the powerful Countess Valerius. The hall buzzed with the practiced hum of forced camaraderie, the sound of silk brushing against velvet, and the clinking of crystal glasses that masked sharp, judging scrutiny. Every smile here was an appraisal, every laugh a calculated deflection. Alara navigated the initial hours with a commendable grace. She complimented the architecture, she praised the vintage wine. She listened with rapt attention to the droning tales of military exploits. But under the surface sheen of polite engagement, the air was taut, vibrating with unacknowledged resentments and deadly ambition. It was during a brief lull in the formal toasts that the opportunity and the peril presented itself. A minor lord, bearing an obscure piece of jewelry, recounted an anecdote about his lineage from a distant, forgotten province. The story, by nature of its obscurity, required generalized admiration. Instinctively, Alara offered a compliment regarding the lord's ancestral ties to the region. It was meant to be flattering, but her phrasing contained a subtle thread of fatal arrogance. She remarked that while his history was fascinating, it lacked the vitality and palpable grandeur she witnessed in the court's own founding families, a delicate phrase that, overheard by those with sharp ears, sounded less like flattery and more like pointed omission. She implied, through sheer articulation, that their origins were charmingly provincial compared to the established glory of the current regime. The shift was immediate and chilling. The laughter that had been rippling across the mahogany tables died abruptly. It didn't fade, it snapped off, leaving behind a vacuum filled only by sudden, acute awareness. Alara, realizing her blunder in the instant it left her lips, watched the intricate social network around her freeze. The Countess Valerius, whose own pride was legendary, did not need to speak. Her gaze simply settled upon Alara, a weight of disappointment and suspicion that felt physically crushing. It was 1,000 unsaid judgments conveyed through perfectly sculpted disapproval. The compliment, intended to earn favor, had instead established her as an arrogant newcomer, dangerously aware, and perhaps most damningly, someone who dared to measure others against her own internal yardstick of value. A lethal judgment had been passed, not by law or trial, but by the volatile chemistry of whispered expectation. Survival now depended entirely on recovery, on transforming a social misstep into an undeniable display of wit so profound it would shock suspicion back into admiration, turning indictment into intrigue. The ensuing hours were a tightrope walk over a pit of concealed enemies. Alara needed to prove not merely that she was clever, but that her judgment was safe. She could not afford to be defined by the compliment itself. She had to redefine herself entirely through subsequent actions. She began observing the subtle power dynamics, realizing that everyone at this table was engaged in a silent calculus. The wealthy merchants were desperate to impress the crown prince with their connections to exotic goods, making them seem less like financiers and more like indispensable global players. The veteran courtiers lived by rumor, feeding scraps of information about minor feuds across adjacent counties, thereby reminding everyone that power flowed from narrative control. Alara understood quickly that in this setting, the truth was not a reliable source. It was merely raw material awaiting refinement by gossip. The objective was to become an essential node in the court's volatile network of whisperings. She began by subtly changing the subject matter around her. When another guest made an overly grand declaration about their family wealth drawn from newly acquired lands, she didn't challenge the money. Instead, she questioned the narrative supporting it. She inquired, with feigned academic curiosity, about the local agricultural cycle, asking not how much they possessed, but how sustained their supply of grain truly was, and whether its transport routes were reliable during the upcoming rains. The conversation deftly pivoted from the glittering surface of gold and jewels to the gritty reality beneath. Logistics, necessity, vulnerability. She forced them, through polite questioning, to demonstrate practical knowledge that money alone could not purchase, the deep-seated understanding of the land and the people who worked it. This shift was her first counterstrike. By showing an interest in the tangible mechanisms of survival, hunger, transport, seasonal blight, she managed to deflate the inflated ego of the landed gentleman, grounding the discussion into something relatable, something vital. The next phase required even more risk. A notoriously fickle and influential lady-in-waiting, Lady Isolde, known for her destructive whispers, was seated nearby. Isolde had a habit of deploying half-formed accusations, a glance too long, a phrase meant to imply questionable allegiances. Tonight, however, Alara used the subtle artistry of manufactured ambiguity against her. When Isolde made a veiled comment about the difficulty of keeping secrets within the court's close circles, implying that someone present had betrayed trust. Alara waited until there was a momentary lull in general conversation. She leaned slightly across the table, making sure her tone suggested intimate confidence and mutual conspiracy. She did not name anyone, nor did she mention any specific secret. Instead, she spoke of the sheer difficulty of knowledge. She discussed how secrets themselves held value, not merely those concerning treason or love, but small, innocuous details. Who paid for whose last portrait sitting? Which household servant was seen conversing with a rival faction's courier 3 days prior? She suggested that these small expenditures of truth were often far more potent and less damaging than grand accusations. This wasn't a defense, it was an offensive statement on the nature of intelligence itself. Alara didn't deny secrets existed. She redefined their currency, elevating them from scandalous whispers to manageable forms of highly valuable, granular commodity. She positioned herself not as innocent, but as a knowledgeable arbiter of courtly data. The subtle shift in perception was nearly visible. The powerful lords and ladies who had been preparing their poisoned compliments suddenly quieted. They understood that she hadn't deflected the accusation. She had simply broadened the scope of the battlefield, making all reputation conditional upon a relentless management of minor, potentially compromising facts. Alara finally managed to achieve her goal. She was no longer merely the brilliant newcomer who misspoke at dinner. She had transformed into someone whose judgment, though startlingly unconventional, held an undeniable strategic weight. The price of the initial compliment had been her perceived innocence. The payment for her survival was the acquisition of a reputation for sharp-edged calculation. The banquet ended not with a polite farewell, but with a lingering sense of potent uncertainty among the courtiers. They left knowing that when Alara spoke, whether about grain yields or the price of gossip, nothing was purely accidental. Every smile now felt less like warmth and more like assessment, perpetually waiting for the slightest misstep or the next opportunity to profit from one. The court is never silent. It is a symphony of whispers, a complex, carefully orchestrated cacophony that drowns out the truth entirely. Here, words are not meant for understanding. They are weapons, meticulously sharpened and launched from veiled lips into the soft chaos of high society. Reputation in these walls was less about inherent worth and more about the meticulous upkeep of silence. Scandal was not merely reported here. It was manufactured, spun like silk thread through a vast, unseen loom, designed to bind and choke its victims slowly. We are looking at the whispering gallery, the invisible architecture of power, where every dropped syllable held the weight of a tax, levy, or the promise of ruin. The physical halls might be adorned with tapestries depicting ancient battles and glorious lineage, but beneath that opulent, veneer ran a current far more volatile. The flow of carefully curated rumors. These were not idle gossip, no. These whispers required craft, strategy, and above all, exquisite timing. They represented an art form, one taught in private chambers to ambitious young women and seasoned court rivals alike. Consider the minor incident that brought Alara into its orbit. A misplaced favor here, a slight wrinkle on this priceless velvet gown there. These details became crucial data points. They were not enough to dethrone a queen or condemn a baron, but they were enough to suggest instability, imperfection, and in a court obsessed with pristine perfection, such suggestions were fatal. The art of manufactured rumor demanded the elimination of direct accusation. Directness was crude. It invited denial and counter-accusation. Instead, power resided in suggestion, in ambiguity itself. The whispered word needed room to breathe, enough space for the recipient, and more importantly, the listener to fill it with their own suspicions. This is where subtle evidence became everything. A folded note found at a discarded shawl, an expensive silk, ribbons snagged on a railing that connected two otherwise separate individuals, a seemingly insignificant glance exchanged across a banquet hall. These fragments were not accidents of circumstance. They were breadcrumbs, dropped intentionally, allowing different factions to pursue multiple contradictory narratives simultaneously. Conspirators who excelled in this craft understood semiotics, the study of signs and symbols. They knew that if they couldn't tell you the truth, they could at least make you believe there were many truths competing for your belief. Imagine a banquet setting, lavish beyond description. Crystal flutes clink with wine so dark it seems to absorb all surrounding light. In this sensory overload, attention falters, and gaps appear, gaps that can be filled by anything the rumor weaver desires. They would not gather in grand assemblies. They preferred the corners, the shadowed alcoves, the peripheral areas where the main flow of conversation felt too loud, too public. Here, in the low hum of private exchange, coded language flourished. A compliment about one's knowledge of obscure classical literature might actually be a veiled accusation of inherited weakness or questionable parentage. A sudden burst of detailed commentary on international trade routes might, in fact, be an exposé designed to make rivals think you had access to classified financial information. The intelligence exchanged was never stated plainly. It required decoding, a language only the initiated truly understood. You listened for the omission as much as you listened for the word itself. If a subject's name fell silent during a discussion of military movements, that silence contained more potent accusation than any audible boast. Alara watched this theater with an unnerving acuity. She had learned quickly that genuine talent was insufficient. Mere competence would be seen as presumption. And presumption in court is always misread as hubris. Survival demanded the mastery of performance, not the act of being noticed, but the flawless art of noncommittal notice. The courtiers around her did not engage with simple facts. They dealt in implications. If one faction needed to destabilize another family without incurring the ire of the ruling house, they would initiate a rumor concerning misaligned loyalties. This meant planting evidence, suggesting that while family was openly admiring the king's latest decree, their minor, unnoticed nephew, or perhaps mistress, had a sudden, inexplicable affinity for the standards colors of a rival dukedom. The power of suggestion allowed the instigators to maintain absolute plausible deniability. No one could ever say, "It was her who whispered that." They could only agree that the rumor started circulating, or that it seemed evident that. This systemic diffusion of blame protected the weavers from any actual fallout, while maximizing their ability to control the political temperature. Alara began practicing this interpretation. She learned to read the micro gestures, the too quick sip of wine by a man who was lying, the slight, almost imperceptible hitch in the breath after delivering a damning suggestion, the specific way silk whispered against stone when passing an incriminating note. These details were her currency. She realized that true social authority was not derived from bloodline or accumulated wealth, but from the perceived capacity to know things others did not, and even more crucially, the ability to make others doubt what they thought they knew. The goal of every whisper, every strategically placed piece of gossip, was to establish a personal reputation as an infallible source of valuable and often contradictory intelligence. The whispers told them everything about who feared whom, whose ambitions were greatest, and which connections were fragile enough to snap with the lightest suggestion of scandal. She developed a specific skill, the ability to participate in a rumor's creation without leaving any personal trace on the fabrication. She would listen intently during these coded conversations, absorbing the rhythm of deceit, only to offer a single, seemingly tangential comment that shifted the focus just enough, a question posed with innocent curiosity that subtly redirected the energy away from a deadly secret and onto a manageable minor indiscretion. It was intellectual warfare conducted over dinner plates. The conversation might turn to the weather or the expense of imported spices, but underneath it all ran the silent, toxic current. Who knew which secrets, and how much was one willing to give up or sell to survive the next hour? In this atmosphere, wit became armor, gossip became currency, and silence became the loudest accusation of all. The true performance of power rarely happens under the bright, straightforward lights of day. It thrives instead in the deep shadows and filtered glow of candlelight, especially when the masks are mandatory. The masquerade ball was not merely a social event. It was a curated stage for deception, where every silk scrap and plume feather was a deliberate prop. Here, identity became fluid, optional, and fundamentally suspect by abandoning recognizable gowns, or even using elaborate disguises. Courtiers could cross boundaries that the rigid laws of decorum usually enforced. You were no longer Lady Alara, whose strategic compliments had first placed her under suspicion. You could be anyone, which meant you potentially knew everything about everyone else. The atmosphere was thick with unacknowledged desire and barely suppressed panic. The rules governing interaction evaporated in the face of anonymity. It allowed for encounters that would have been politically catastrophic during the daylight hours. Secret meetings exchanged across crowded dance floors, conspiratorial whispers overheard from masked pillars, accidental brushes of hands carrying coded messages. Fashion, at its peak, ceased to be art and became a form of camouflage. A specific shade of velvet might signal allegiance to one faction. A particular cut of sleeve might denote a hidden debt or an untapped resource. Jewels were not worn for beauty, but weighted down with symbolic meanings, the sapphire indicating trust in distant lands, the emerald suggesting natural wealth, or perhaps just the family that owned it and whose favor was currently needed. The courtiers navigated this maze with the practiced grace of deep-sea divers. They knew exactly where the currents pulled and how to use the drag of a heavy skirt or the gleam of an oiled wig to misdirect attention. Status markers became tools for deliberate obfuscation. A seemingly frivolous mask might in fact conceal eyes that missed nothing, tracking every glance from rival across the ballroom. For Alara, this environment was simultaneously terrifying and profoundly liberating. Here, her documented lineage, the very thing that had been both source of strength and target of attack, was momentarily nullified. She could move through the halls with a calculated recklessness, testing the boundaries while maintaining plausible deniability at every turn. The whispers intensified here, mutating from vague accusations into specific, though still unprovable, anecdotes. The coded nature of conversation reached its zenith. A brief exchange, overheard by an innocent third party, could be interpreted in 3 wildly different ways. A proposal for alliance, a threat to withhold vital information, or merely 2 strangers discussing the weather. The brilliance of true courtly deception lay in establishing ambiguity as a currency. You did not have to prove your motive, only suggest it strongly enough that others assumed they had solved it correctly, thereby committing them to the shared illusion you wanted them to maintain. She observed the ritualistic encounters, the deliberate accidents. A masked figure stumbling near her shawl, dropping a folded note meant for another. An exchange so brief and seemingly accidental that even if witnessed fully, its true meaning would be lost in the spectacle of the crowd. These moments were not random acts of flirtation. They were carefully choreographed transactions designed to plant seeds of doubt or secure temporary immunity. The stakes were elevated because failure was often seen as a spectacular collapse of character, more damning than any accusation of treason. To be found out, to have one's true identity, and therefore one's true intentions exposed, meant utter political death in that society. Alara began to weaponize the atmosphere itself. She learned to embody what the court called studied indifference, a performance so convincing it disarmed her rivals far more effectively than any outright wit. When pressed for information, she did not deflect with humor. Instead, she offered perfectly vague statements wrapped in excessive flattery. These pronouncements sounded like devotion, but carried the chill undertone of absolute transactional expectation. The masks became literal extensions of her strategy. Sometimes she wore a frivolous disguise that drew all attention to superficiality, allowing deeper probes into conversations happening just beyond the range of visibility. Other times, she adopted an air of studied mystery, making herself an object of intense curiosity, a difficult commodity for rivals who craved control over narratives. The sheer exhaustion was palpable among the players. Maintaining this level of constant performance is a monumental strain on the soul. Every breath must be calculated. Every tilt of the head must suggest either profound wisdom or crippling distraction. The courtiers were not simply enjoying themselves, they were surviving, and survival demanded becoming professional actors in an endlessly demanding tragedy. The ball reached its peak decadence, a dizzying spiral of whispered secrets, exchanged over spiced wine, and the scent of expensive perfume, masking something far more dangerous: outright treachery. Alara watched her rivals, their elaborate costumes failing to conceal the sweat of ambition on their brows. They had all believed they were superior players. She realized that the true masters of this game understood that the most potent disguise was not a mask at all. It was the blank slate of genuine irrelevance. Until the precise moment it needed to become absolute power. We thought we understood the architecture of intrigue. We believed that whispers were simply private conversations and compliments mere social graces. But in the gilded cage of the medieval court, truth itself was merely a seasoning. The greatest battlefield wasn't the outer fortress wall or the muddy field of battle. It was the dining table. Dinner did not mean sustenance. It meant interrogation. Every silver platter represented an accusation, every spiced wine a subtle poison waiting to be sipped back at one's rivals. Here, the meticulous performance of conviviality masked a psychological inquisition. To simply exist at this feast required both supreme refinement and a ruthless edge. The act of eating itself was subverted into an art form of veiled aggression. Consider the simplest gesture, selecting a course, which dish to compliment, which spice to mention, and with what loaded ambiguity. One wrong choice could imply everything from poor lineage to outright disloyalty, all without uttering a single explicit treasonous word. The courtiers had mastered the delicate art of gastronomic espionage. They didn't just criticize the cooking, they critiqued the origins of the ingredients, which often mirrored political boundaries or disputed alliances. If a dish contained saffron from the newly conquered eastern province, its praise could be interpreted either as celebration or as implicit acknowledgement of recent bloodshed and subjugation. It was a coded commentary on geopolitics, disguised by rich sauces. The protagonist now understood that suspicion was best nurtured not through direct assault, but through suggestion, and nothing served to suggest better than an overly detailed critique of a meal. When the steward presented the centerpiece quail, coated in rosemary and sweet wine reduction, Alara did not merely compliment its flavor. She drew attention to the deep green notes of the rosemary, pausing as if lost in thought. Then she mentioned that this particular bouquet reminded her of herbs cultivated only near the old border fortifications, a region known for both its exceptional foraging and its recent, particularly brutal skirmishes. The comment was innocuous enough for a first-time listener to dismiss as an anecdote about garden herbs. Yet, among those who remembered the volatile history of that borderland, the implications struck like a shard of glass. How fresh were these memories? Were we still paying attention to what was lost? Another courtier, Lord Gavril, known for his excessive bluster and questionable taste in anything too subtle, took this observation as an opening. He leaned forward conspiratorially, drawing himself into the spotlight. Indeed, he announced, a false warmth in his tone, the aroma of distant conflict always does accompany fine food. It speaks to experience. His comment was superficially agreeing, but its timing and overly enthusiastic delivery signaled that Alara's hint had successfully punctured the polite facade, allowing him to redirect the focus onto her perceived depth of knowledge, and thereby claiming a share in it. It was here Alara demonstrated the crucial evolution of her strategy. She did not correct Gavril for his clumsy pivot, nor did she retreat into silence. Instead, she used the subject matter he had so clumsily established to make herself seem more valuable. She smiled, acknowledging his participation, but refusing to grant him ownership of the exchange. Experience, she murmured, focusing her gaze on a passing servant who adjusted the linen napkins, thus widening the scope beyond mere conversation, is often not found in what we eat, my lord, but in remembering where it must travel from which hands it has passed. The shift was subtle, profoundly potent. She moved the discussion away from geography and conflict, subjects that might provoke direct royal reprimand, to the logistics of service itself, the labor, the movement, the interconnected web of people necessary to make this luxury possible. It was a strategic deflationary tactic. By praising the efficient handling of the linen, she shifted the center of gravity from intellectual maneuvering among the elite to the physical reliability and unseen cooperation required by the lower servants. Suddenly, intelligence wasn't merely about whispered treason. It was also about supply chains, manpower reserves, and who controlled the passage of goods. The remaining courtiers watched her with renewed, complicated respect. Her wit had proven adaptable. She could tackle high philosophy one moment and the placement of a bread basket the next. She transformed herself from an educated dilettante into a shrewder, more pragmatic arbiter of intelligence. If power lay in controlling suspicion, Alara was proving that true authority resided in mastering the overlooked details. The meal continued, morphing into a prolonged act of passive observation and mutual threat assessment. The next exchange centered on the dessert course, a delicate trifle layered with candied fruit and custard. A rival noblewoman, Countess Valona, notorious for her superficial charm but deep envy, attempted to undermine Alara by criticizing the ingredients as common and overly sweet. "It is too much." Valona sighed dramatically, fanning herself lightly. A delightful trap, perhaps, designed more for youthful exuberance than sophisticated palate. Valona's challenge was meant to diminish Alara's apparent sophistication. But Alara recognized the move. She did not defend her own taste. She attacked Valona's underlying motive, the desire to look superior. She leaned slightly toward the head table, adopting a tone of deep, considered academic pity. "Countess," Alara began, making direct eye contact that felt disproportionately intense for the polite setting. "You speak of sweetness as a trap, which implies it holds some secret malice. Yet, is it not sometimes the most necessary form of sustenance that appears simplest? A steady comfort. True refinement, I find, does not necessarily come in the guise of exotic poison or political revelation. Sometimes it is merely the quiet assurance that something will simply arrive when promised." The meaning was layered. Alara suggested Valona was projecting her own insecurities onto the dessert. She implied that true value was reliable and predictable, like a steady source of intelligence, rather than an unstable burst of superficiality. The implication was clear. Valona's perceived refinement was brittle, dependent on fragile external appearances, whereas Alara's wisdom derived from observing enduring reality. The psychological weight of this exchange settled heavily over the table. It was not a loud triumph. It was a careful repositioning of boundaries. Alara had successfully elevated her own performance from witty conversation to high-level political commentary, achieving a formidable plateau in the treacherous game of courtly survival. She learned that the ultimate weapon at any feast was the capacity to make others feel observed, exposed, and perpetually suspect, all while maintaining the flawless veneer of polite hunger, the elegant chaos of the court could shift from a deadly carnival to something far more confined, far more dangerous. The walls that had previously seemed merely ornamental now felt like confessionals, designed not for quiet reflection, but for pointed indictment. The whispered art of the banquet dissolved into the cold geometry of the Privy Council chamber. This was where public performance ended and institutional betrayal began. The drama shifted from the dazzling flash of silks and flippant compliments to the weighty silence that precedes a decree. Here, ambition was stripped of its glitter and left exposed as raw political leverage. No longer were we discussing who spoke too loudly or whose gown displayed questionable taste. We were confronting matters of state, finances, military alliances, and the sacred covenant between nobility and crown. In this intimate setting, far from the prying eyes of the court's general populace, the threat was distilled to its purest form: accusation. The weapon was no longer a well-placed rumor or an ambiguous garment. It was irrefutable knowledge, the kind that proved disloyalty through mere omission, the sort that could unravel years of carefully constructed reputation with a single opened ledger or a half-remembered testimony. The rules were simple, yet impossibly complex. You did not merely disagree with policy. You had to find and exploit the personal moral failing embedded within your rival's public service record. The battle was waged over details: the suspicious fluctuation in border tariffs, the single unaccounted shipment of exotic dyes, or a whispered acquaintance made on a whim, far from courtly propriety. This chapter revealed that true power resided not with those who held titles, but with those who controlled the flow and interpretation of damaging information. The courtiers did not debate policy for the greater good. They debated it solely to establish whose fingers were safest to point at, and how devastating that accusation would be. Alara, having learned to weaponize ambiguity in the lavish halls, now faced a crucible where subtlety was replaced by rigid, documented fact. She found herself surrounded by men and women of considerable power, individuals who spoke with measured gravitas, each word intended not merely to convey information, but to cement their superior standing in the hierarchy. She watched as seemingly innocuous conversations spiraled into accusations of treasonous negligence. A disagreement over tax collection became a referendum on loyalty to the crown itself. The stakes were life, and execution, reputation, meant nothing when faced with charges against the realm. Yet, even here, where the subject matter was grave, the personal dimension could not be ignored. Every point of policy criticism had to be framed as evidence of moral turpitude or political weakness. The established players thrived on this proximity to power. They excelled at triangulation, subtly implying that your perceived failure in one area, say, insufficient funding for frontier garrisons, was actually proof of a deeper personal disloyalty, perhaps funded by rival houses or foreign agents. Alara, initially unsettled by the sudden plunge into such stark seriousness, quickly adapted. She realized that while the language had become weighty and official, the underlying mechanism remained disturbingly similar to the Masquerade ball. It was all about performance and controlling the spotlight of judgment. Where she once used compliments to divert focus, here she learned to use meticulous cross-examination, the ability to demand specifics, cornering a rival not on their grand theory, but on the precise wording of their original proposal. She transformed herself from an observer into an essential interrogator, making her invaluable not for her own ideas, but for her unique capacity to locate and articulate the hairline fractures in others' defenses. The courtiers were masters of deflection. When pressed too hard about a personal connection or a specific lapse in judgment, they would suddenly pivot with practiced grace, shifting the focus from their failing to an insurmountable flaw in the questioner's memory, credibility, or emotional stability. It was a spectacular display of intellectual jujitsu. At one point, facing a highly influential, aging statesman who had built his power on decades of whispered favors and strategic ignorance, Alara saw her opportunity. The statesman accused a minor faction, a group she knew to be politically vulnerable but militarily harmless, of financial corruption. It was an attack designed to eliminate them and absorb their influence into the council's sphere. Instead of defending the accused or even attacking the charges directly, Alara performed a feat of supreme redirection. She did not challenge the existence of the missing funds. She challenged the asterisk process asterisk by which they were supposedly misplaced. By asking highly technical questions about jurisdictional signatures and Treasury account mandates, details few present could possibly recall, she accomplished two things simultaneously. First, she exposed the statesman's superficial understanding of actual accounting law. And second, she redirected the room's focus from who was corrupt to whose bookkeeping methods were flawed. This shift in inquiry created a paralysis. The accusation died not because it was disproven by evidence, but because it became too difficult to sustain through rigorous process. The political scandal had been neutralized by an overwhelming display of technical expertise and intellectual authority. She learned that while the Privy Council dealt with matters of state, these men and women were ultimately merely performing for their peers. They saw themselves as stewards of history, but in reality, they were vying for a single commodity: access to the monarch's ear, which equated directly to survival. The entire process was theater, the grandest stage being the very machinery of government itself. The lesson imprinted on her was absolute. Visibility is not the goal. Control is. To truly survive in the deepest chambers of power, one must become less visible as an emotional actor and more potent as an indispensable resource, a mind that knows precisely where to find the chink in the armored plot. It was a chilling realization. The most dangerous conversations were those held under the guise of official duty, where truth, if articulated with enough clinical precision, could be more lethal than any poison. The performance required her to embody impeccable skepticism, never assuming sincerity, always demanding verifiable proof, and above all, maintaining an air of detached intellectual superiority. The spectacle was not in making a grand declaration, but in the quiet, unnerving accumulation of small, verified facts, until they formed an inescapable wall around a rival's credibility. The polished surface of the court was not merely a place for polite conversation. It was an economic exchange. Every glance, every murmured compliment, every offered service carried a precise, weighted price tag. To survive here, to ascend above the endless drift of minor nobility, one had to master the art of transactional affection. Favor, in this viper's nest of lineage and ambition, was never free. Alara understood this cold mathematics better than anyone. She no longer sought compliments for her wit or pity for her lack of birthright. She viewed herself as a commodity, meticulously priced by the needs of the most powerful men in the room. The flirtation that unfolded around her was not a dance of hearts, but a complex negotiation conducted under silks and candlelight. The Lord Kalen represented the apex of this transactional power. He possessed immense wealth, military influence, and above all, a dangerously unpredictable attention. His gaze held the promise of patronage, the very survival she had craved since arriving in this gilded cage. But patronage demanded collateral. Their exchanges unfolded with a studied intimacy that felt both profoundly personal and utterly detached. A shared glance across a banquet table might imply a deep understanding, yet it was merely the assessment of mutual value. Kalen would speak vaguely of geopolitical stability or agricultural yield, never addressing her in direct terms, forcing her to read the hidden currency in his casual pronouncements. Alara learned that the most effective form of flattery was not praise at all. It was calculated vulnerability combined with utility. She did not attempt to charm him with beauty alone, for beauty here was too common a resource. Instead, she offered him clarity, the clear intelligence about his rivals, the predictable weaknesses in the council structure that kept him from absolute power. This knowledge, gathered through discreet listening and careful observation, became her most potent offering. She would wait until he was relaxed, perhaps after a long day of arduous political maneuvering, when his guard dipped just low enough to allow for meaningful contact. Then the conversation would shift seamlessly from high policy back to shared, conspiratorial whispers, creating an illusion of mutual reliance that masked the cold ledger-keeping beneath. She wasn't seeking romance. She was selling proprietary information. One afternoon, near the dimly lit gallery, where political agreements were sealed with the scratch of a pen and a drink of spiced wine, Kaelin pressed her on something more personal, a question designed to gauge her emotional loyalty, or perhaps her availability. He spoke of hardship in his northern holdings, hinting at the need for a discerning mind by his side. Alara maintained that studied indifference she had mastered during the masquerades. Her responses were perfectly weighted, polite enough not to offend, ambiguous enough not to commit. She never accepted the title of advisor without first negotiating its scope and payment. The implicit contract she was drafting with him was far more precise than any legal writ. The danger lay in mistaking her professional acumen for personal sentiment. Kaelin, accustomed to women who flattered his ego or wept into his sleeve, found her calculated neutrality unnerving. It suggested that he could only earn respect by providing value, not merely by granting favor. This made their interactions dangerously electric. The exchange was constantly hovering on the edge of perceived emotional investment versus ruthless pragmatism. The gravity of this transaction became apparent when a minor scandal threatened to unravel another noble house's standing, a house connected tangentially to Kaelin's interests. The whispers began, murmurs of misplaced allegiances and financial debts. It was a threat that could cascade into something far graver, accusations of treasonous dereliction. Alara observed the details of this impending disaster. She saw where the threads of suspicion were weakest, where minor inconsistencies in accounts or delayed messages provided enough ammunition for ruin. Instead of allowing Kaelin to simply silence the scandal with coin, the easier way out, she presented him with a curated intelligence package. She didn't just point out the flaw, she reconstructed the narrative surrounding it. She laid out the pattern. How a seemingly benign debt had been leveraged into suspicion. How an intercepted letter was misinterpreted because the courier route was conveniently undocumented. She provided not only the facts, but also the necessary context to understand why those facts were damaging. It was forensic storytelling for this comprehensive analysis of political decay, for identifying the exact leverage points in a house's vulnerability. She demanded something specific, tangible, and deeply valuable. Immunity from the accusations being leveled against her own lineage, ensuring that when the dust settled over the ruined houses, she would remain untouched by the resulting chaos. Kaelin was both impressed and disturbed. Her intellect was undeniable, a gleaming tool in the murky machinery of court politics. He saw not merely a clever companion, but an indispensable asset, a professional agent capable of wielding truth like poison. The realization settled over him that she operated outside the conventional bounds of courtly womanhood, Her loyalty was transactional, her affections purely strategic. The exchange crystallized into a chilling understanding. Every act of intimacy in this court carried a ledger, and Alara knew how to write figures where others only saw poetry. Her survival did not depend on love or grace. It depended entirely on her ability to perpetually assess the market value of secrets, vulnerabilities, and carefully managed compliments. She had mastered flirtation as the ultimate currency exchange, transforming social interaction into profitable espionage. It was a brutal education, one that ensured she would never again mistake a flattering gesture for genuine warmth, only its quantifiable worth. After the careful dance through whispers and council chambers, after understanding that every compliment could be a trap and every whispered secret an asset, Alara had achieved a fragile form of power. She navigated the high stakes with surgical precision, turning reputation into quantifiable currency. But even the most carefully constructed political edifice is subject to sudden collapse. In the medieval court, stability was less about solid foundations and more about who held the sharpest knife. And today, that razor's edge came to rest on a single individual, one whose failure was designed to send shockwaves through every ambitious corner of the hall. The air in the great hall was heavy, thick with expensive perfumes and unspoken accusation. The festivities had momentarily paused, replaced by an unnerving stillness. Lord Vorlag, once known for his blustering arrogance and undeniable lineage, stood center stage. His downfall was not signaled by a sudden clash of steel or even a whispered conspiracy. It was orchestrated by the mundane mechanisms of courtly performance itself, ritualized public defeat. It began with an insult veiled as a jest. A minor noble, barely worth mentioning outside of his family name, had cornered Vorlag and delivered a highly public critique of his skill at falconry. It wasn't merely an insult. It was meant to diminish him in front of the most powerful witnesses, the Queen's inner circle, the Duke himself. The crowd chuckled with false amusement, but beneath the laughter lay the cold calculation of predatory vultures. Alara watched from a calculated distance, observing the geometry of humiliation. She had seen this performance before. The exquisite discomfort of one man forced to acknowledge his inferiority in front of peers who felt no genuine pity, only satisfaction. It was an art form, the taking of dignity and broadcasting it as entertainment. And today, she realized that Vorlag's vulnerability represented a critical pivot point for the entire court structure. The chief architect of this humiliation, however, was not so easily discernible. The pressure built incrementally. Vorlag, attempting to regain his footing, boasted of his wealth and ancient entitlements, detailing deeds of lineage stretching back generations. This boasting was exactly what the antagonists needed. They seized upon these verifiable claims, the precise details of a minor skirmish in a distant border village, the specific tally of land, tax owed 2 decades past, and twisted them into evidence of moral failing. The performance demanded that Vorlag not only accept the accusation, but must perform the role of the repentant failure. The humiliation progressed through stages. First, the public correction of a factual error. Second, forcing him to make amends or pay an ostensible fine. And finally, forcing a moment of physical subservience, a bowing, a withdrawal, a temporary loss of status that was meant to be indelible. It was designed not just to punish, but to rewrite his social contract in real time. While the spotlight focused entirely on Vorlag's agonizing descent, Alara continued her subtle work, absorbing the mechanics of the ritual. She noticed how the attendees behaved, their gazes flicking between detached interest and barely concealed delight. They were not simply observers, they were co-performers, finding comfort in the downfall of others. The lesson being taught was crystal clear. In this court, your worth was contingent upon your flawless performance, both when triumphant and when fallen. The ultimate act, however, was a more profound form of degradation, the demand for manufactured confession. They didn't just accuse him of incompetence, they implied treasonous indiscretion with a foreign power, or worse, a failure in familial duty that compromised the state. To prove his loyalty, he had to admit not only a sin, but an source of dangerous information, giving away a truth that was politically damaging, even if it were merely fiction. Alara watched him stammer, desperate to save any shred of remaining respectability. The poison wasn't the accusation itself. It was the public acceptance of the accusation by his peers. The ruling class found it more satisfying to witness the collapse than to simply rule on its merits. It proved their own self-appointed moral authority. As the ordeal concluded, Vorlag dismissed, stripped of title and immediate favor, left a hollow shell of his former self. Yet, for Alara, this was not an end, it was a transaction. She had witnessed the full spectrum of social death, the perfect execution of public defeat. It taught her that true power lay in being both invisible enough to observe these rituals without taint and strategically positioned enough to benefit from the ashes. The spectacle served as a brutal lesson for all remaining players. Do not mistake momentary victory for permanent standing. Today's hero can be tomorrow's punchline. The court was revealed to be less a political body and more an infinitely complex theater, where every person lived in perpetual anticipation of their own fall or the staged collapse of a rival. Alara finally moved, her path crossing subtly with those who remained powerful, untouched by the day's spectacle. She offered no pity, only a knowing glance, a look that suggested she understood the brutal arithmetic underlying the entire event. The most valuable intelligence, she knew, was not gleaned from overheard whispers or captured notes. It was the knowledge of how society itself would engineer and consume a downfall, providing a blueprint for her own flawless ascent. The court, having witnessed the brutality of public humiliation, had already taught its residents a grim lesson in self-preservation. Status was not merely inherited. It was a finely balanced illusion, susceptible to sudden collapse at the whim of a clever whisper or the cutting edge of verse. Yet, even after navigating the wreckage of Vorlag's public defeat, the currency of power remained unstable, shifting from open accusation to subtle literary malice. The greatest danger now lay not in the visible act of confrontation, but in the delicate architecture of suggestion itself. Our protagonists had mastered the whispered rumor and the tactical compliment. They were ready for the ultimate sophistication. The attack woven into art, the air in the great hall felt thick and brittle, charged with the kind of potential energy that precedes a sudden, devastating blow. After navigating the poisoned compliments, weaponized whispers, masquerades of false identity, and the brutal lessons of public humiliation, Alara stood at the apex of the political storm. All roads led to this moment. The King's Council was gathering not merely to deliberate policy, but to perform an appraisal, a final judgment on who among them possessed sufficient loyalty and cunning to survive the coming era. The stakes were no longer mere rumors or lost favors. They involved lineage, land rights, and the continued physical safety of her family. The tension was a visible thing, tightening the silk of everyone's garments. Lord Vorlag, recently savaged in public, sat slumped near the dais, his attempt at dignity having been methodically stripped away by those who enjoyed orchestrating discomfort. Meanwhile, her primary rival, Sir Valerius, maintained an aura of polished arrogance, radiating confidence derived from years spent mastering subtle disloyalty. His gaze never left Alara, a promise of calculated ruin passing between them with every minute's silence. The moment required not wit or even impeccable appearance, but absolute sacrifice. It demanded the ultimate performance, one that severed any remaining claims to her past self. The council gathered around the central table, arranged in a careful semicircle designed to maximize visibility and minimize escape routes. They were prepared for grand speeches, denials of guilt, elaborate justifications of ambition. But Alara understood that such overt performances only created more material for attack. The true power lay in rendering oneself utterly indispensable, yet profoundly vulnerable. She began by speaking not of her innocence, or even the state's immediate military needs, but of forgotten history. She cited archaic decrees regarding resource distribution during times of plague and famine, drawing upon obscure legal texts that few present minds would bother to study. It was a calculated act of intellectual dominance, using the weight of established law against those who prided themselves on modern revolutionary thought. Valerius scoffed, a controlled ripple of disdain passing across his face. He countered by invoking recent precedents, the latest edicts concerning trade tariffs and border disputes. The debate spiraled outward from forgotten laws to contemporary cash flow, forcing Alara into the deep water of logistics and immediate solvency. She adjusted her tone, instantly pivoting away from arid law toward a precise accounting of potential assets. She spoke eloquently about the mismanagement of the northern salt mines, not accusing anyone outright, but outlining the systemic failure in oversight that bled the royal coffers dry. By focusing on the mechanism of loss, rather than assigning personal blame, she subtly repositioned herself as an administrator of meticulous detail. Immune to emotional histrionics, the confrontation escalated when Lord Gregor, a peripheral figure who had remained silent throughout the entire ordeal, suddenly interjected with a historical parallel, a tale of a previous crown's downfall rooted in financial graft and false claims. His intervention was designed to derail Alara by associating her proposed remedies with an ancient, known point of failure. The room shifted, anticipating the inevitable pivot, either denial or acceptance of fatal guilt. Alara did neither. Instead, she paused, let the silence stretch until it became physically uncomfortable for every person present, and then performed the final move. She spoke about her family's greatest failing, something deeply personal and materially devastating, a secret transgression from generations past that had once nearly ruined their name. It was a confession of profound professional negligence concerning ancient trade routes, an indiscretion that should have ended her standing immediately, sealing her fate as guilty before she could utter another word. By volunteering this ruinous history to the room, she did something far more powerful than any denial. She took control of the narrative's source material. She established herself not as a pristine ideal, but as someone with known, complex flaws, a flawed resource that was entirely reliable. The effect was immediate and profound. The intensity radiating from Valerius flickered, momentarily disturbed by the unexpected magnitude of her sacrifice. Gregor, the architect of the trap, faltered, realizing that the supposed fatal flaw she offered to the court could now be studied under a magnifying glass, a known commodity rather than a sudden indictment. She had weaponized her own past. This was not simply admitting guilt, it was declaring, "Take this inconvenient truth and use it for your benefit because I have handed it over freely." She continued by explaining the mechanism of that old failure, the exact flaw in tracking shipments through hostile territory, which required a level of systemic oversight no one else present possessed. The discussion transitioned away from her personal moral failing to the practical engineering of its solution. Her opponent was no longer her integrity. It was the flawed map they all needed corrected. She rebuilt her identity instantly, not as an untainted noblewoman, but as the singular expert in navigating dangerous geopolitical logistics, a resource so uniquely valuable that any attempt to exile or discredit her would cripple the entire court's operational capacity. Sir Valerius recovered quickly. Spitting a retort laced with venom, he attempted to undermine her authority by suggesting her detailed knowledge only proved her desperation for favor and money, reducing her sophisticated performance to a mere transaction of need. The room became hostile once more. Alara waited, letting his contempt wash over her like physical heat. Then she delivered the final blow, not with an argument, but with an agreement that circumvented the entire debate. She did not ask for immunity or protection. Those were transactional demands too easy to refute. Instead, she offered something irreversible and necessary: a complete restructuring of the Royal Intelligence Network, built upon her own compromised history, requiring immediate implementation and total trust. She laid out a framework so complex, so logically flawless in its contingency planning, that it became impossible for the council to dismantle without simultaneously admitting their profound inability to govern. By forcing them into acceptance of her functional genius, she achieved an untouchable status, one that transcended mere reputation. The expulsion was denied not by favor, but by necessity. They could not afford to challenge the framework she had laid down, nor could they ignore the undeniable utility of her knowledge. The king, finally breaking the tense silence, simply nodded, his gaze conveying a mixture of weary admiration and profound caution. Alara had successfully reframed herself from a social contender into an institutional pillar, a permanent fixture required for the survival of the regime itself. She left the council meeting having accepted ruin to gain absolute professional necessity, ensuring that her existence was now woven inextricably into the tapestries of their deepest power structures. The spectacle concluded with a chilling sense of inevitability. She had not been cleared. She had merely been repurposed, eternally bound to the dark theater of courtly service. Glittering facade of the court had finally fallen away. The roar of manufactured scandal, the feverish drama of accusation and counter-accusation, had subsided into a heavy, breathless silence. Alara did not celebrate in that quiet moment. She stood by a tall stained glass window overlooking the inner courtyard, where filtered morning light painted dust motes dancing over polished flagstones, a fragile, beautiful reminder of how easily everything could be displaced, just as easily gathered up again. The immediate victory felt less like triumph and more like profound fatigue. Every word spoken over the last several weeks, every practiced glance, every manufactured note of feigned surprise had taken a monumental toll. She was alive. She was safe within the impenetrable lattice of royal favor. Yet she carried the hollowed echo of countless performances in her bones. The cost of surviving the curtain call was not gold or titles. It was something far more insidious: the gradual erosion of her own authentic self. The woman who had entered the court at a bright, naive pitch, viewing its customs as complex social rules to be mastered, now saw only the brutal engine of survival. She realized that genuine emotion, joy, despair, genuine spite, was a weakness the courtiers treated like spilled wine, something beautiful to watch, but utterly detrimental to holding power. The remaining figures in the great hall moved through the wreckage of the evening's events with a practiced indifference. Lord Callan, whose protection she had so expertly leveraged, regarded her from across the room, his smile having lost its pre-dinner warmth, settling into something permanent and knowing. His regard was not affection, it was assessment. He saw in her not just a surviving player, but a highly polished, valuable weapon that he now owned the schematics to wield. To him, she was less a woman and more a perfectly balanced ledger of actionable secrets. The court itself seemed muted, drained of its usual vibrant malice. The artificial intensity that had fueled their lives, the need to prove one's worth through public disgrace or whispered superiority, had briefly sputtered out with the sun. This stillness, she observed, was perhaps more terrifying than the scandal itself. It meant the cycle could reset with frightening efficiency. They were masters of disruption, not stability. Earlier, when she had meticulously spun a narrative that redefined her family's transgression as a necessary structural adjustment to the kingdom's logistical flow, she felt a surge of professional satisfaction. She had successfully repositioned herself from being merely useful to being absolutely essential. She was no longer an aspiring courtier seeking favor. She was infrastructure. The system itself required her specific brand of knowing ambiguity. Yet, as the daylight intensified and the residual scent of expensive perfume mixed with stale wine lingered in the air, Alara felt a peculiar ache. It wasn't just the exhaustion of performance. It was the realization that while she had mastered the art of deception and reinvention, she had done so by systematically dismantling her own belief in genuine connection. She remembered an almost careless moment early on, a shared glance with a visiting merchant about the unpredictable nature of foreign trade, stripped of political implication, merely two people sharing a practical observation. That memory felt like sunlight glimpsed through years of thick velvet curtains. It was a phantom limb she hadn't known she possessed. The courtiers were not simply gossips. They were poets of malice, sculptors of repute. They could take a single random truth, a forgotten minor debt, an offhand comment made under the influence, the specific weight of silk thread on a gown, and transform it into high tragedy or breathtaking comedy, depending entirely on who paid to be entertained. This constant, hypervigilant state of being is its own sort of imprisonment. She knew how to read the invisible architecture of power now. Every gesture held coordinates. Every compliment contained coded measurements of weakness. Silence was a deliberate, weighty vacuum designed to force others into oversharing their anxieties. She finally turned from the window, facing the halls, gathering shadows. The lesson she had learned in these few weeks was not merely how to survive scandal, but what survival truly demanded: absolute detachment. One must observe humanity as if one were examining exotic, volatile chemistry, brilliant reactions, unstable residues, and predictable points of explosion. To feel invested meant to risk nothing. To be impervious meant to gain everything. It was a cold, perfect transaction. The quiet murmurs began again. A junior courtier whispered something brittle about the quality of the wines served at dinner, a comment easily dismissed, but structurally useful nonetheless. Another coughed delicately, directing the attention toward Lord Vorlag, who remained seated, quietly absorbing the morning's residual judgment. The whispers were not meant to ignite a fresh scandal. That would be too much effort for this early hour, but rather to reaffirm the fragile, delicate ecosystem of mutual suspicion that sustained them all. They were confirming their shared reality. Beneath the luxury and the formality lay nothing but calculation. Alara understood then that she had achieved not just status, but a kind of quiet, permanent immunity. She was privy to secrets deemed too valuable or too toxic for anyone else in the room to touch. She carried the accumulated knowledge of their weaknesses, the minor financial inconsistencies, the deeply held unspoken affections, the forgotten family slights. And this knowledge, contained within her carefully cultivated composure, was her true and ultimate inheritance. The scandal had not broken her. It had simply revealed the breathtaking scope of her own ruthless capacity for reinvention. She smiled, a subtle, practiced expression that conveyed nothing at all, before stepping back